The mountains hold secrets that the living were never meant to understand. I learned this the hard way during my third year as a ranger in the Appalachian region when I was assigned to monitor the sacred grounds surrounding some of the oldest burial sites in North America. What I experienced in those months changed everything I thought I knew about the boundaries between our world and whatever exists beyond it. My name is Thompson. I have been a park ranger for 17 years, and in that time I have seen things in the wilderness that I cannot adequately explain to anyone who has not lived it. But this story, this particular account, demands to be told. The burden of silence has become too heavy. It was October 15th, 2019 when I received the transfer notice. I was being assigned to oversee the Ashwood Memorial Preserve, a protected area spanning 15,000 acres in the heart of the Appalachian Mountains. The notice mentioned historical significance, archaeological sensitivity, and the need for a ranger with impeccable attention to detail. I was curious about the posting, but not alarmed. I had managed similar assignments before. What I did not know, what they did not tell me, was that this particular preserve contained something that had been actively avoiding human scrutiny for over 200 years. Ashwood Memorial Preserve was established in 1978, but the cemeteries within its boundaries date back much further. The oldest graves were from the 1790s when settlers first began pushing into the deep mountains. There were graves from the 1800s, Victorian stones with elaborate carvings. There were graves from the 1900s, simple markers worn smooth by decades of rain and wind. And then there were the older burials, the ones that predated the stones, marked only by changes in the ground elevation and the arrangement of rocks. My first week was routine. I walked the perimeter trails, checked the maintenance status of the monuments, verified that the access roads had not been damaged by weather or vandalism. I met with the Historical Society representatives who maintained records of the cemetery maintenance. They were pleasant, professional, and they exchanged meaningful glances whenever I asked questions about the older sections. One of them, a woman named Eleanor Harris, finally offered something more than polite deflection. We were standing near the eastern boundary, where the oldest section began to blend into the raw forest. Eleanor was pointing out the locations of some graves that required restoration work when I asked directly if there was anything I needed to know about this particular preserve that was not in the official documentation. Eleanor hesitated. She looked at the forest, then at the graves around us, then back at me. Her words were measured. She said that rangers who worked this preserve tended to develop particular behaviors after a few weeks. Some became obsessed with the boundaries. Others became obsessed with the graves themselves, spending hours reading the names and dates. A few became convinced that they were being watched. Eleanor said that the Historical Society had learned, through painful experience, that the best approach was to be direct about what the rangers would likely encounter. There were stories, Eleanor said. Very old stories. Stories that the local families in the surrounding towns told to each other. Stories that they told their children as warnings. Stories about something that had always been here. Something that belonged to the cemetery and resented the presence of the living. The stories had been passed down for generations, and while most people dismissed them as folklore, the Historical Society had learned to respect them. I asked Eleanor what the stories said specifically. Eleanor said that I would be better off experiencing it myself. That way, I would understand, and I would not dismiss what she was telling me as the ravings of superstitious old women. She told me that if I needed her, I should call. She gave me her personal number. I did not call Eleanor Harris for another 6 weeks. That first month, the preserve felt normal. Yes, there was a strange quality to the forest when I walked alone, an awareness of something watching from the periphery of perception. But I attributed this to the natural isolation of the work, to the way the human mind projects intentionality onto empty spaces, to the psychological effects of solitude in wild places. I kept meticulous records, as I was instructed. I logged my daily patrols, the locations I covered, the conditions I observed. I took photographs of the graves that needed attention. I documented the wildlife that moved through the preserve. It was not until the middle of November, on the 15th, that I recorded the first anomaly. I had been conducting a thorough survey of the oldest section of the cemetery, the one that Eleanor had pointed out to me. I was mapping out the locations of stones that needed preservation work, trying to make sense of the chronological progression of the graves. This section of the cemetery did not follow the organized grid pattern of the Victorian and modern sections. The graves were scattered, some facing different directions, some without any marker I could identify. I remember that the day was cold and gray. Clouds hung low between the mountain peaks, and there was a dampness in the air that suggested snow was coming. I was alone, as I always was during these surveying trips. I wore the standard Park Service uniform, a heavy jacket, and carried my usual equipment: camera, GPS unit, notebook, compass, and emergency radio. I was perhaps 2 miles from my truck, deep in the older section of the cemetery, when I noticed something strange. The grave markers in this area were becoming increasingly crude and irregular. The stones were smaller, rougher, less shaped by human hands. And then I came across a section where the graves seemed to overlap. At first I thought I was misreading the layout. But as I moved through this area more carefully, I confirmed that the graves were indeed overlapping. Multiple people had been buried in the same plot, stacked in ways that violated every modern cemetery regulation. Some of the markers were so old that the inscriptions had weathered into illegibility. I took photographs and made notes. This was something the Historical Society needed to know about. It was as I was backing away from one of these overlapped graves that I noticed the depression in the ground. It was subtle, a slight sinking of the earth, but it formed a perfect circle. It was perhaps 3 feet in diameter, and it was positioned between 3 of the oldest graves. I moved closer to examine it. There was no marker for this depression, no stone, no visible indication of burial. It looked like something had created a small pit and then filled it in, though the fill had settled and created this hollow. I was kneeling down, preparing to document this with my camera, when I heard the sound. It came from the forest behind me, from the thick growth of dark pines and skeletal deciduous trees. It was the sound of something heavy moving through the underbrush, something large enough that I could hear distinct footsteps despite the soft forest floor. I stood up and turned toward the sound. The forest was dark beneath the cloud cover, the depths between the trees almost black. I called out. I identified myself as a park ranger and asked if there was someone there. The sound stopped. I waited for a response, some indication that another human being was in the preserve. But there was only silence, and the silence had a quality to it that made the hair on my neck stand straight. I decided to return to my truck. I was not afraid, not yet, but I was alert. Something about the situation felt wrong in a way I could not articulate. As I walked back through the cemetery, retracing the path I had come from, I did not hear the sound again, but I remained aware of the presence in the forest, the sense of being tracked by something unseen. It was not until I reached my truck and locked the doors that I realized how fast my heart was beating. That night, I called Eleanor Harris. Eleanor asked me to describe exactly what I had heard. I told her about the heavy footsteps, the way the sound had emerged from the forest without warning, the quality of the silence that followed. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. Then she asked me a series of questions. Had I seen anything? Had I smelled anything unusual? Had I noticed any changes in the animal behavior around me? To all of these questions I said no. I had seen nothing, heard nothing but the footsteps, smelled nothing out of the ordinary. Eleanor said that I had been fortunate. She told me that what I had heard was almost certainly the headless guardian, but that it was not interested in me. If it had been interested, she said, I would not have made it back to my truck. I pressed her for more information. Eleanor, to her credit, gave me answers. The headless guardian, according to the local tradition, was not a ghost in the conventional sense. It was something that had been bound to this cemetery when it was first established. According to the oldest stories, there had been a man who was buried here in the 1790s without his head. The head had been removed deliberately, as punishment for some transgression. Some versions of the story said he had been a slave who had attempted to escape. Other versions said he had been a settler who had betrayed someone to an enemy. The specific crime had been lost to time, but the fundamental fact remained. This man had been buried incomplete, and his burial had been marked with a particular ritual meant to bind him to the cemetery as a guardian. The purpose of this binding was to keep the graves protected, to keep grave robbers and desecrators away, to ensure that the dead remained undisturbed. For 200 years it had worked. Eleanor told me that the headless guardian was not malevolent in any human sense. It had no personal animosity toward the living. It was, rather, an extension of an ancient compact, a supernatural obligation that had been part of the cemetery since its consecration. It protected the graves and punished those who violated the sacred ground. I asked Eleanor what constituted a violation. Eleanor said that most violations were obvious: grave robbing, desecration, deliberate damage. But there were subtler violations too: disrespect toward the graves, disregard for the sanctity of the cemetery. Most importantly, the presence of certain intentions within the preserve. If someone came to the cemetery with the purpose of disturbing the dead or profaning the grounds, the guardian would know, and it would act. I asked Eleanor if my presence in the cemetery as a ranger conducting surveys and documentation constituted a violation. Eleanor did not think so. My purpose was preservation and protection, which aligned with the guardian's purpose. But I needed to be respectful. I needed to approach the graves with proper reverence. I needed to be aware that I was not alone. I asked Eleanor what happened to rangers who did not show proper respect. Eleanor's voice became very quiet. She told me that over the years there had been rangers who lasted only a few weeks in the position. Some had quit without explanation. A few had been found, wandering near the cemetery, in states of extreme psychological distress. One, about 10 years ago, had been found sitting in his truck in the cemetery parking lot, completely catatonic. He had remained institutionalized. Eleanor did not elaborate on what had happened to cause his condition, but the implication was clear. I thanked Eleanor for the information and ended the call. That night, I did not sleep well. I lay in my small ranger station cabin and listened to the wind in the trees. The cabin was warm and safe, but I could not shake the feeling that something was moving in the forest around me, waiting, watching, assessing my worthiness to remain in this place. The next morning, I made a decision. I would approach this assignment differently. I would treat the cemetery not as a historical site to be studied and documented, but as a sacred place to be respected. I would be meticulous in my work, careful in my movements, and reverent in my approach. I began a new regimen. Each morning, before I entered the preserve, I would stand at the entrance and acknowledge the dead. I would speak, quietly, explaining my purpose, to protect and maintain the grounds where they rested. I would ask permission to proceed, and I would move through the cemetery with a pace that reflected the solemnity of the place. This continued for 2 weeks without incident. The sense of being watched diminished somewhat. I still felt a presence in the forest, but it seemed less hostile, more like a guardian keeping vigil than a predator stalking prey. Then, on November 27th, something changed. I was conducting a survey in the central section of the cemetery, an area dating from the 1840s to 1900s. The graves here were well maintained and clearly marked. I was taking photographs for the Historical Society when I noticed one grave that seemed to have been recently disturbed. The grave belonged to Edward Harris, who had died in 1887 at the age of 42 years. His grave was positioned beneath an old oak tree, and someone had placed fresh flowers in front of his headstone. But more concerningly, someone had also scratched away some of the engraved lettering on his stone. The damage was fresh, probably done within the last few days. I documented the damage and made a note to contact Eleanor about it. Then I continued my survey. That evening, I received a call from Ronald Sanchez, one of the county police officers. Ronald said that there had been a report of vandalism at the cemetery. Someone had broken into the cemetery at night and disturbed a grave. Was I the ranger assigned to the preserve? I confirmed that I was. I told Ronald that I had found evidence of vandalism at one grave that morning, but I had not found evidence of actual grave disturbance. Ronald said that the report had come from a local resident who lived near the cemetery boundary. The resident said they had heard sounds from the cemetery around midnight, sounds of digging and movement. Ronald asked if I could check the cemetery for evidence of grave tampering. I agreed to do so immediately. I ended the call and prepared to return to the cemetery. The sun was setting, and I was about to drive into darkness, but something about this felt urgent. Something about the report of midnight disturbance, combined with the fresh vandalism I had found, suggested a pattern. I arrived at the cemetery in the full darkness. My truck headlights cut through the night, illuminating the entrance gate and the road leading into the preserve. I grabbed my flashlight and a heavier jacket, then began my search. I moved methodically through the cemetery, checking each grave, looking for signs of recent disturbance. The ground was cold and slightly frozen, which made it easy to see if anyone had dug or moved earth. Most of the cemetery showed no signs of tampering. It was when I reached the oldest section, the one with the overlapped graves and the mysterious depression I had found weeks earlier, that I found something disturbing. The circular depression I had documented was no longer there. Instead, there was a shallow pit, perhaps 2 feet deep and 3 feet across, with fresh earth scattered around it. Someone had dug into the ground directly above where the depression had been. I stood at the edge of the pit and swept my flashlight across it. The pit was empty. Whatever had been there, whatever the person had been looking for, they had not left any indication of success or failure. As I was examining the pit, I heard the sound again. This time, it was closer, the sound of footsteps, heavy and deliberate, coming from the forest. But this time there was something else as well. There was the sound of something being dragged. There was the sound of something that might have been breathing, heavy and labored. I turned my flashlight toward the sound, sweeping it across the dark forest. The beam cut through the trees but illuminated nothing but empty space. I called out, I identified myself as a park ranger and demanded that whoever was present identify themselves and cease their activities. There was no response, but the sounds did not stop. The footsteps continued, moving through the forest parallel to my position. The dragging sound continued, and underneath everything was that heavy breathing, getting slightly closer. I made a decision. I ran. I ran back toward my truck, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly ahead of me. I did not look behind me. I did not want to know how close the sounds were. I simply ran, moving as fast as I could through the dark cemetery, vaulting over low graves, dodging trees, desperate to reach my vehicle. I made it. I threw myself into the driver's seat, slammed the doors, and locked them. I started the engine and pulled away from the cemetery, my hands shaking on the wheel. As I drove, I looked in my rearview mirror. In the distance, at the edge of my truck's headlights, I saw something that made my blood go cold. It was the vague outline of a figure, standing at the edge of the forest. It was tall, impossibly tall, and its upper body seemed to taper off into darkness, as if the head was obscured by shadow, or simply was not there. I accelerated and did not look back again. I did not sleep that night. I sat in my cabin with every light on, my service pistol on the table beside me, and I waited for dawn. When sunlight finally came, I made 3 phone calls. The first was to Eleanor Harris. I told her what I had found, the pit, the signs of deliberate excavation. I told her what I had heard and what I had seen. Eleanor was silent for a long time. Then she told me something that made everything worse. Eleanor said that the body of the headless guardian was entombed somewhere in the oldest section of the cemetery. Its exact location had been lost to time, but according to the oldest records kept by the Historical Society, it was buried in a location that was marked differently than other graves. The records referred to it as the guardian's seat, a place where it was bound to the earth and could not leave. What I had found, Eleanor told me, was almost certainly that grave. Someone had been trying to dig it up. The second call was to Ronald Sanchez. I told him that the vandalism was serious, that someone was actively disturbing the cemetery, and that I suspected foul play of a serious nature. I asked for increased police patrols in the area. Ronald agreed to increase patrols and suggested that I file a formal incident report with the Park Service. The third call was to my supervisor at the Regional Park Service office. I explained the situation in clinical terms: vandalism, attempted grave disturbance, trespassing at night, potential criminal activity. I requested increased security measures and backup. My supervisor, a man named Timothy Clark, listened patiently and then told me something I had not expected. He told me that the Ashwood Memorial Preserve had a history of incidents that defied rational explanation. Rangers had quit. Investigators had been puzzled. The Park Service had learned, over the years, that sometimes the best approach was to simply document what happened and maintain the preserve's security without asking too many questions about the nature of the problems they were trying to prevent. Timothy told me that he had read the ranger journals from 3 previous assignments at Ashwood. Each ranger had reported strange events. Each ranger had described sounds, sightings, and a sense of being watched. Most importantly, each ranger had eventually reported that there were people in the surrounding communities who seemed to be targeting the cemetery for reasons that were not clear. Timothy believed, based on this pattern, that there were people who knew about the headless guardian and wanted to disturb it for their own reasons. Perhaps they were curious. Perhaps they believed it contained treasure. Perhaps they had their own supernatural beliefs and wanted to somehow bind the guardian, or release it, or interact with it. Whatever their motivation, these people were dangerous. Timothy told me that the best thing I could do was maintain secure access to the cemetery, log all suspicious activity, and call local law enforcement if I encountered any trespassers. The Park Service would back me up. The next day, I met with Ronald Sanchez and Jason Ramirez, another county officer, at the cemetery. I showed them the pit I had found. I showed them the grave vandalism. I explained my theory that someone was deliberately attempting to excavate a specific grave. Ronald and Jason were professional and thorough. They photographed the pit, took measurements, and examined the surrounding area for additional evidence. They found nothing except a single cigarette butt, which could have belonged to anyone. Ronald asked me if I had any theories about who might be responsible for the disturbance. I did not. I had been in the area for only 2 months. I did not know the local people well. I had limited social interaction outside of my work. Jason suggested that I might be looking at grave robbers, people who targeted old cemeteries hoping to find valuable items buried with the dead. They came at night, worked quickly, and left minimal evidence. I did not tell them about Eleanor's stories or about what I had seen in the forest. I knew they would not believe me. and I did not want to be reassigned for psychological evaluation. Instead, I agreed with Jason's theory and told them that I would increase my vigilance. Over the next 2 weeks, I implemented several security measures. I installed motion-activated lights around the oldest section of the cemetery. I began conducting nighttime patrols, leaving my cabin at random intervals to walk the grounds and check for any sign of activity. I marked the pit with warning tape and documented its location with GPS coordinates. I also began to notice something else. The longer I spent in the cemetery, the more I became aware of the individual graves. I found myself reading the names and dates on the headstones. I found myself learning the stories of the people buried there. I found myself, in a strange way, becoming invested in the protection of this place. I think this was when I began to truly understand the purpose of the Headless Guardian. It was not there to harm the living, it was there to protect the dead. And by spending my days and nights protecting the cemetery, by treating it with reverence and respect, I was aligning myself with that purpose. There were nights when I would sit near the oldest graves and simply listen to the forest. There was a peace in those moments, a sense of belonging to something larger than myself. I began to understand, viscerally, the weight of history contained in this place. Generations of families had come here to honor their dead. The graves were not just markers of mortality, they were connections to the past. Threads that linked the present to centuries of human experience, and someone was trying to violate that sacred space. My anger at the potential grave robbers grew. I became obsessive about the security of the cemetery. I walked the perimeter multiple times per day. I inspected every grave. I documented everything. It was during one of these walks, in the middle of December, that I found the evidence I had been waiting for. There was a section of the cemetery fence, on the eastern boundary, that showed signs of disturbance. The fence had been cut, creating an opening large enough for a person to pass through. Beyond the fence, in the forest, I found a path that had been created by repeated passage. The path led away from the cemetery, disappearing into the deeper forest. I followed the path for about half a mile. It led to an old logging road, long since abandoned, where I found evidence of recent activity. There were tire tracks from a vehicle, fresh enough that they had probably been made in the last few days. The tracks led deeper into the forest, toward the mountains. I marked the location with GPS coordinates and reported it to Ronald Sanchez. Ronald and I met at the logging road the next day. He brought Jason and a third officer, Jeffrey, to help with the investigation. We followed the vehicle tracks, which led to an old cabin, long abandoned, that had been used at some point as a base camp for logging operations. The cabin was in disrepair, but there were signs of recent activity. Someone had been using it. We found camping equipment inside, food supplies, and most disturbing, a collection of old maps and documents related to the cemetery. One of the maps was annotated with markings showing the location of the oldest graves. Another had a large circle drawn around a specific location in the oldest section, with the words "Guardian Seat" written next to it. Ronald looked at me with new understanding. He said, "They know what they are looking for." I nodded. Someone, somewhere, had learned about the Headless Guardian and the location of its burial. They had come to the cemetery to excavate it, probably in the middle of the night to avoid detection. Now the question was why. We brought the maps and documents to the county police station for analysis. Ronald and his team began investigating possible suspects. They checked for recent activity permits in the forest, interviewed people who lived near the cemetery, and looked into any local organizations that might have been involved in grave disturbance or occult activities. It took 2 weeks of investigation, but they finally identified a suspect. His name was George White, and he was a researcher from out of state who had been renting a house on the edge of the county for the past 3 months. George had no criminal record, but his background was interesting. He was a self-proclaimed expert in supernatural history and folklore, and he had published several papers about American burial customs and the folklore surrounding them. What made George particularly suspicious was that his most recent research had focused specifically on Appalachian cemetery legends and burial practices. He had been in contact with several local historians and had specifically requested information about the Ashwood Memorial Preserve. Ronald brought George in for questioning. I attended the interrogation, sitting in an observation room with Jason. George did not deny his involvement in the cemetery disturbance. He did not seem ashamed of it either. He seemed rather excited, almost proud of what he had been doing. George explained that he had become obsessed with the legend of the Headless Guardian after reading an obscure historical document in a university archive. The document, written by a cemetery maintenance worker in the 1920s, described in detail the burial of the guardian and the specific location where it was entombed. George believed that the guardian was not a supernatural entity but rather a carefully constructed psychological construct, a story that had been perpetuated through generations to scare people away from a specific grave. He theorized that beneath that grave lay evidence of something important, something that the original cemetery founders had wanted to hide. George had come to Ashwood to excavate the grave and discover what was hidden beneath it. Ronald asked George if he had actually dug up the guardian's grave. George said that he had not succeeded. He had attempted to, several times, but each time he began digging in the correct location, something prevented him from continuing. The first time, he said, he had experienced a feeling of overwhelming dread, a panic so intense that he had abandoned the shovel and run. The second time, he had heard sounds in the forest, sounds of something moving toward him, and he had fled without finishing the dig. The third time, George said, something had actually happened. He was about an hour into the dig when he became aware of a presence behind him. He said that he did not see anything clearly, but he saw the shadow of a figure, impossibly tall, and he saw what looked like the outline of a head-shaped absence, as if the shadow had no head but stood upright anyway. George said he screamed and ran without looking back. He did not return to the cemetery after that. Ronald asked George why, if he was so frightened, he had continued to remain in the area, why he had not simply left. George's answer was surprising. He said that he could not leave. He said that every time he tried to pack his belongings and depart, he would find an impediment. His car would not start. His belongings would go missing. He would wake up with no memory of the night, only to find that he had walked miles into the forest and had to find his way back. George said he believed that the guardian was keeping him there, that it did not want him to leave. He said he thought he was being punished for his violation of the grave. Ronald looked skeptical, but there was something in George's voice that suggested he genuinely believed what he was saying. The investigation became complicated at this point. There was no clear evidence that George had actually excavated any grave. The pit I had found could have been made by anyone. The maps and documents in the cabin proved that George had been researching the cemetery, but not necessarily that he had desecrated it. Without definitive evidence of a crime, Ronald had to release George with a citation for trespassing and a warning to stay away from the cemetery. But something had shifted. George was terrified. Whatever he had experienced in the cemetery, whether it was supernatural or psychological, it had genuinely frightened him. He told me, as I was escorting him out of the police station, that he would be leaving the area immediately. He said that the guardian had defeated him, that he respected its power to protect the dead, and that he would never return to the cemetery. I believed him. After George left, I returned to the cemetery with renewed purpose. I filled in the pit myself, carefully, respectfully, as if I were re-entering something sacred. I repaired the fence that George had cut through. I removed all traces of his presence, and then I did something that I had not done before. I walked directly to the location on George's map, the place marked as the guardian's seat, and I stopped. The location was slightly higher in elevation than the surrounding graves. There was an old, weathered stone marker, barely visible beneath decades of lichen and moss. I could not read the inscription. I did not attempt to clear it. Instead, I knelt down in front of the stone and I spoke. I told the guardian that I understood its purpose. I told it that I respected its commitment to the protection of the dead. I told it that I would continue to maintain this cemetery, to defend it against those who would violate it, to honor the graves of all who rested here. And I asked the guardian to teach me how to recognize those who came with ill intent, so that I could protect the cemetery without violence, through wisdom and awareness. As I was speaking, I felt a change in the air around me. The temperature dropped several degrees, the sounds of the forest seemed to quiet, and for just a moment I felt the presence of something vast and ancient, something that had been rooted to this ground for more than 2 centuries. And then the moment passed. I stood up and walked back to my truck. That night, as I was recording my findings in the ranger log, I felt different. Not changed, necessarily, but aligned. I was no longer a ranger who happened to be assigned to this cemetery. I was a guardian of this cemetery, a protector of the dead, a keeper of the graves. In a way that I could not fully explain, the headless guardian had accepted my presence. The rest of December passed quietly. The cemetery was undisturbed. No trespassers appeared. The motion-activated lights I had installed remained dark. The only sounds in the forest were the natural sounds of winter, wind in the trees, the distant call of hawks, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. But I was increasingly aware of a presence that moved through the cemetery after dark. It was subtle, easy to dismiss, but once I began paying attention to it, I could feel it constantly. It was there when I walked the perimeter. It was there when I sat at my cabin window, looking out over the grounds. It was there in the moment before I fell asleep, and in the moment after I woke. The headless guardian was watching, but now I understood that its watchfulness was not a threat. It was a commitment, a dedication to protection, a refusal to allow the sacred ground to be violated. In January, I received a package at my cabin. The return address was from Eleanor Harris. Inside the package was a book, very old, with a leather cover and yellowed pages. The title, written in faded gold lettering on the spine, read, Memoirs and Records of the Ashwood Cemetery, being an account of the founding and maintenance of sacred ground, 1792 to present day. Eleanor had included a note with the book. She wrote that she had been keeping this book in the Historical Society's private archives, and that she had decided I should have access to it. She wrote that the previous rangers had not been given this information, and she regretted that. She wrote that if I was to truly serve as the guardian of this cemetery, I needed to understand its history. I spent the next several weeks reading the book. It was written in multiple hands, different people recording information at different times. The earliest entries were from the 1790s, written by the founder of the cemetery, a man named Thomas Ashwood. Thomas Ashwood had been a settler with deep knowledge of Native American traditions and folklore. According to his writings, the land where the cemetery was established had been a sacred burial ground for a tribal nation that had been displaced from the region decades earlier. Thomas believed that by establishing a cemetery on this land and treating it with proper reverence and protection, he could honor the sacred nature of the ground. But he was also practical. He knew that people, even settlers, sometimes violated sacred ground. They desecrated graves, they removed items, they showed disrespect. Thomas wanted to create a protection for the cemetery that was more than merely physical, so he performed a ritual. The ritual involved the body of a man who had been executed for a crime, a man named Isaiah Freeman. Isaiah had been a fugitive slave who had been captured and brought to justice. His execution had been brutal, and it had been decreed that his body would be mutilated as a further punishment. His head was removed. Thomas Ashwood, according to his writings, took the headless body and buried it in a specific location within the cemetery, at the point that he had identified as the geometric center of the sacred ground. He performed a ritual, drawing on both Native American and Christian traditions, in which he bound the spirit of Isaiah Freeman to the cemetery, making him its eternal guardian. The purpose was clear in Thomas's writings. The guardian would protect the dead from violation. It would punish desecration. It would ensure that the cemetery remained sacred. Most importantly, Thomas wrote, the guardian would only recognize and accept a human ranger who approached the work with genuine reverence and a commitment to protection. Any ranger who came with disrespect or with intent to exploit the cemetery would be rejected. The guardian would make them aware of its displeasure. Later entries in the book, written by different hands over the decades, confirmed that this system had worked. There were accounts of grave robbers who had fled in terror. There were accounts of cemetery maintenance workers who had been forced to leave because they could not tolerate the presence of the guardian. There were accounts of the guardian itself, sightings of a tall figure that moved through the cemetery at night, always watching, always protecting. But there was also something else in the later entries. There was an understanding, expressed by multiple rangers over multiple decades, that the guardian was not evil. It was not a demon or a curse. It was a protector, as committed to its purpose as any human ranger could be. Rangers who approached the work with respect and a genuine desire to protect the dead found that they could coexist with the guardian. More than coexist, they could work alongside it, an alliance between the living and the dead, between the human and the supernatural. The final entry in the book was from 1989, written by a ranger named Michael Chen. Michael wrote that he had served as the ranger at Ashwood for 7 years, and that in that time he had learned more about the nature of sacred ground and human responsibility than he had learned in all his prior life. Michael wrote that the guardian had taught him that the dead, while no longer present in the world of the living, still deserved respect and protection. He wrote that the graves were not mausoleums of the past, but rather continuations of the people who had been buried there, a presence in the earth that demanded to be honored. Michael wrote that he was leaving the position to take a different assignment, but that he would carry the lessons of Ashwood with him for the rest of his life. After reading the book, I felt a deep sense of connection to all the rangers who had come before me, all of whom had faced the same strange circumstances, the same sense of being tested, the same eventual understanding that this place was sacred and that my role was to be its defender. I wrote my own entry in the book. I added the pages directly to the leather binding, continuing the tradition. I recorded my experience with George White, the excavation he had attempted, and the moment when I had knelt before the guardian's grave and offered my commitment to protection. I wrote about the feeling of alignment I had experienced, the sense that my work at this cemetery was not merely a job but a calling. I wrote about the headless guardian itself, and what I had come to understand about its nature. It was not supernatural in the way that stories sometimes described ghosts or demons. It was more like a fundamental force, an intention given form, a manifestation of the sacred oath that Thomas Ashwood had created more than 200 years ago. As long as there was someone here to protect the cemetery, to show respect to the dead, the guardian would remain. It would watch and defend. And if someone came with the purpose of violation, it would make itself known. It would use whatever means necessary to prevent desecration. And those means, I had begun to understand, were not primarily violent. The presence of the guardian, the mere awareness of its existence, was usually enough to deter the worst intentions. People like George White came to the cemetery driven by their own curiosity and their own beliefs. But when faced with the reality of the guardian's presence, they began to understand that some places were beyond their ability to comprehend or control. In February, I received a letter from George White. He was writing from his home in New York, where he had returned after leaving the county. In the letter, he apologized for his violation of the cemetery. He wrote that he had experienced something in that place that had fundamentally altered his understanding of the world. He wrote that he no longer believed in the purely rational explanation for the guardian. George wrote that he was continuing his research but from a distance now, interviewing people about similar cemetery legends and similar stories of protective spirits bound to sacred ground. He was writing a book about these traditions, about the way different cultures had created supernatural protection for their burial grounds. He wrote that his experience at Ashwood had been the most profound of his life, and that he would never forget it. I did not respond to George's letter, but I kept it. I filed it away with the ranger logs and the documentation of the incident, and life at Ashwood continued as it always had. I walked the cemetery, I maintained the grounds, I respected the graves, and I felt, always, the presence of the headless guardian watching over us all, a silent commitment to protection that had endured for more than 2 centuries and would continue to endure for as long as there were people to remember that the dead deserved to rest in peace. Spring came to the Appalachian Mountains with a sudden rush of green and noise and life. The cemetery, which had been silent and dormant through the winter, began to wake. The graves were visited by families bringing flowers, birds returned to nest in the old oak trees, groundwater began to flow again through the channels it had carved over decades. I noticed changes in my own awareness as the weather warmed. The sense of the guardian's presence became less constant, less obvious, but no less real. I began to understand that the guardian was not always as visibly active during times when the cemetery was peaceful. It withdrew, in a way, into the ground itself, into the very stones and soil of the cemetery. But it was always there, always watching, always ready to respond if needed. In March, I was conducting a routine inspection of the oldest graves when I found something I had not noticed before. It was a gravestone, very old, with a name partially obscured by lichen and weathering. I began to carefully clean it, removing the growth of moss and lichen that had accumulated over many decades. As the stone became clearer, I was able to read the inscription: Isaiah Freeman, born 1752, executed 1792, buried in sacred ground. The stone was positioned in the oldest section of the cemetery, but not at the location marked on the Historical Society's maps as the guardian's seat. This stone was isolated, set slightly apart from the other graves, positioned at an elevation that made it one of the highest points in the cemetery. I stood before this grave for a long time. This was the man whose body had been used to create the guardian. This was the man who had been executed and mutilated, whose headless body had been buried here at the direction of Thomas Ashwood. I thought about what that must have meant. I thought about Isaiah Freeman's experience, his capture and execution, his humiliation and his mutilation. I thought about whether his spirit would have willingly accepted the role of guardian, or whether the ritual that bound him to this place had been a form of further violation. And yet, over 200 years, the guardian had protected the cemetery. It had kept grave robbers at bay. It had kept the sacred ground inviolate. Whatever Isaiah Freeman's original circumstances, whatever the questions about consent and violation in his binding, the reality was that his role as guardian had resulted in actual protection, actual preservation of sacred space. I decided to make a gesture of respect toward Isaiah Freeman specifically. I brought flowers to his grave the way families brought flowers to honor their dead. I spent an afternoon carefully cleaning his gravestone, removing all the accumulated lichen and moss, revealing the full inscription. When I was finished, I spoke to him directly. I told him that I understood, as much as a living person could understand, the sacrifice that he had been asked to make. I told him that his work mattered, that the cemetery he protected was treated with reverence and respect by the families who came to honor their dead here. I told him that I was honored to work alongside him, to carry on the work he had begun more than 2 centuries ago. As I was speaking, I felt something shift. It was not dramatic. There was no supernatural manifestation, but there was a sense of acceptance, a sense of acknowledgement from the cemetery itself. That night, I added a new entry to the historical record book. I wrote about my experience finding Isaiah Freeman's grave and what it meant to know the specific identity of the guardian. I wrote that it was important for future rangers to understand that the guardian was not an abstract supernatural force, but a human being, someone who had experienced injustice and whose spirit had been bound to a sacred purpose. I wrote that part of the ranger's responsibility was to honor Isaiah Freeman specifically, to remember his story, to acknowledge the sacrifice that he had made in binding himself, even against his will, to the protection of sacred ground. As I was writing these words, I realized something profound. The guardian had never been designed as a punishment or a curse, not really. Yes, it had been created through a ritual, and yes, it had been designed to frighten people away from the cemetery, but its true purpose was protection. Isaiah Freeman, bound to this place, had been given the ability to do something that mattered. His mutilation, his injustice, his execution, these could not be reversed or redeemed. But his role as guardian meant that for more than 2 centuries he had been doing work that was meaningful, that was necessary, that was valuable. In a strange way, this had given his suffering a purpose. I do not know if this would have been any comfort to Isaiah Freeman in his final moments as he was being executed. But from my perspective as the ranger, as someone who had experienced the guardian's protection and understood its dedication to sacred purpose, I could see that his work mattered. By late spring, I had settled into a deep rhythm with the cemetery. My work was no longer something I did from obligation or professional responsibility. It had become, in some fundamental way, part of my identity. I was a protector of sacred ground. I was a guardian of the dead. I was a living liaison between the community and the centuries of history contained in this place. I began to conduct regular talks at the local library and community centers, speaking about the history of the cemetery and the importance of treating burial grounds with respect. The stories that I told, drawn from the historical records and from my own experience, resonated with people. Several families came to me with their own stories about Ashwood, stories passed down through generations about ancestors buried here and the reverence that should be shown to them. In June, I conducted a special commemoration ceremony at the cemetery for Isaiah Freeman. I invited Eleanor Harris and several members of the Historical Society. I invited local families whose ancestors were buried at Ashwood. I invited Ronald Sanchez and Jason Ramirez from the county police who had come to understand the unusual nature of this place. During the ceremony, I spoke about Isaiah Freeman's history, about the circumstances of his execution, and about the role he had played in creating the protection that had kept the cemetery sacred for 200 years. I acknowledged the injustice of his treatment. I honored the sacrifice that he had been asked to make, and I promised, on behalf of the Park Service and on behalf of everyone present, that his work would be remembered, and that the cemetery he protected would continue to be treated with the reverence it deserved. As we stood before Isaiah Freeman's grave, I felt something that I had come to recognize as the guardian's acknowledgement. It was subtle, a warming of the air, a sense of completion, a feeling that something important had been witnessed and honored. By the middle of summer, I had been at Ashwood for 8 months. The assignment that I had initially viewed as simply another posting had become central to my life. I could not imagine leaving this place. I could not imagine not being here to maintain the cemetery, to protect it, to honor the dead and their guardian. I made the decision to request a permanent assignment. I submitted paperwork to the Park Service indicating that I wanted to remain at Ashwood indefinitely, that this was where I felt my work had genuine meaning. My request was approved without complications. Timothy Clark, my supervisor, called to congratulate me and told me that he was glad I had found a place where I could do meaningful work. He said that not many people understood the sacred responsibility that came with maintaining burial grounds, and he was grateful that I did. I hung up the phone and looked out from my cabin window at the cemetery spread before me. The graves visible in the late afternoon light, the old oak trees casting long shadows, the grass beginning to turn gold as summer progressed. I thought about Isaiah Freeman, bound to this place for more than 2 centuries, watching over the graves, protecting the dead, ensuring that their rest was not violated. I thought about Thomas Ashwood, who had created this protection with intention and ritual, who had believed that sacred ground deserved to be honored. And I thought about myself, a ranger in the present day, carrying on the work that they had begun, maintaining the continuity of protection and respect that spanned centuries. The cemetery was quiet. The guardian was watching. The dead rested in peace. And I was home. You know that feeling when something is watching you but you cannot see it? That moment when the hair on your neck stands up and your body knows something that your mind refuses to accept? I have spent 23 years working as a park ranger in the wild regions of Pennsylvania, Appalachia, and I have learned to trust those instincts. This is the story of what I found in the depths of Spruce Hollow and why I will never go back to that place again. My name is Benjamin Green. I was born and raised in these mountains. My father was a ranger before me and his father before him. We understood the land in a way that outsiders never could. We knew which paths were safe. We knew which caves to avoid. We knew the rhythms of the animals that lived here. But there were always things in the old stories, things that the locals whispered about after dark, things that previous rangers had mentioned in cryptic notes in the station logs. And then, in October, everything changed. It started on a Tuesday morning at 4:57. I remember checking my watch in the darkness of my truck as I drove up to the ranger station. The autumn air was cold and dry. The leaves had turned that deep red and gold that makes the mountains look like they are on fire. But on that morning, something felt different. The normal sounds of the forest were absent. No birds, no insects. Just the crunch of my boots on gravel as I walked toward the door. Inside the station, I found a report on my desk that made my stomach turn cold. Samuel Adams, the other ranger on duty that week, had left a note about unusual animal tracks found near the eastern ridge. He had discovered them on Monday while checking the trail maintenance markers. The description he had written was precise and detailed. Samuel was not the type to panic or exaggerate. He had noted that the tracks were massive, large enough that they could not have belonged to any known animal in the region. He had measured them, 8¾ inches wide, and there were only 4 of them visible before they simply stopped, as if something had simply ceased to exist on the forest floor. I read that note 3 times, and with each reading my sense of dread grew deeper. By the time Samuel arrived at the station at 6:30 in the morning, I had already assembled the equipment I would need for a full investigation. A camera with a good zoom lens, a detailed measuring kit, a topographical map of the eastern ridge, binoculars, a recording device, and, though I did not tell anyone, a rifle loaded with rounds I had purchased from a private collector, ammunition that was not standard issue and that would be difficult to explain if anyone asked questions. Samuel looked exhausted. His usual neat appearance was disheveled. His eyes were red from what I assumed was lack of sleep. He sat down across from me without speaking and simply stared at the cup of coffee I had prepared for him. "You saw something else," I said. It was not a question. Samuel nodded slowly. "I came back last night," he said, "after dark. I know I shouldn't have gone alone, but I could not wait until morning. I could not stop thinking about those tracks. So I took a flashlight and I drove back up to that location." "And?" I prompted, though I was not certain I actually wanted to hear his answer. "The tracks were still there, but now there were more. They formed a pattern, like something had been circling, going around and around the same area, and the circles were getting smaller, tighter, like it was hunting something or someone." I felt that cold sensation deepen in my chest. "Samuel, did you see anything else? Any signs of an animal? Blood? Fur? Anything?" He shook his head. "No, nothing. Just the tracks. And this." He pulled a photograph from his jacket pocket and slid it across the desk toward me. The photograph was taken at night with a flash. The quality was not perfect, but I could see what appeared to be a massive footprint in the dirt. It was deep, the kind of depth that would require tremendous weight to create. And in the center of the print there was something that made my breath catch in my throat. It was pale, impossibly pale. In the harsh light of the flash, I could see what looked like fur, but not the dark brown or tan fur of a black bear. This was white, milk white, almost luminescent in the photograph. "I do not know what made that track," Samuel said quietly, but I know it is not any animal I have ever encountered in these mountains. And Benjamin, I think it is still out there. I think it is still in the hollow." That was the moment I should have called for help. I should have contacted the State Wildlife Authority. I should have arranged for a proper investigation with trained personnel and all the correct protocols. But I did not. Something in Samuel's words had triggered something deep inside me. A memory of a conversation I had overheard between my father and another ranger when I was just 12 years old. A conversation about something that came to the mountains in winter, something pale and wrong, something that they never spoke about during daylight hours. "We will go look at the tracks ourselves," I told Samuel, "this morning. We will document everything, and then we will decide what to do." Samuel's expression suggested that he was not happy with this plan, but he also understood that I was in command. And so, at 7:45 on that cold October morning, we loaded our equipment into the ranger station truck and headed toward the eastern ridge, toward Spruce Hollow, toward whatever was waiting for us in the depths of those ancient mountains. The drive took 32 minutes. The road was rough and winding, and I had to navigate carefully to avoid damaging the vehicle. As we drove, the forest seemed to close in around us. The trees became denser. The sky became darker. Even though it was early morning, it felt as though we were driving deeper and deeper into evening. "I am not comfortable with this," Samuel said about halfway through the drive. "The feeling out here is wrong. Can you feel it? The air feels thick. It feels like something is pressing down on us." I could feel it, and I had felt it before, though not in many years. It was the sensation that comes when you are in a place where you are not welcome, where the natural order of things has been disrupted, where something that should not be is now present. "We will be careful," I said. "We will look at the tracks. We will take measurements and photographs, and we will leave before the sun goes down. I promise you, Samuel, we will not stay longer than we need to." He did not look reassured. We parked the truck at the base of the ridge and began hiking up the slope on foot. The vegetation here was dense and twisted. The trees were ancient and gnarled. Many of them had been burned in a forest fire decades ago, and they grew in strange contorted shapes. The path was barely visible, and I had to use a machete to clear the way. Behind me, Samuel followed in silence, his eyes constantly scanning the forest around us. It took us 19 minutes to reach the location where Samuel had found the tracks, and when we arrived, I understood immediately why he had been so disturbed. The tracks were unlike anything I had ever seen. They covered an area roughly 15 feet in diameter. And Samuel was right. They formed a pattern, a spiraling pattern that seemed to circle around a central point. In the center of the spiral was a section of crushed and broken vegetation. Branches had been snapped at heights of 7 and 8 feet. Leaves had been scattered and churned into the dirt. And throughout the entire area there was that pale substance that I had seen in the photograph. Not fur. I realized, as I looked more closely, that it was not exactly fur. It was more like fiber. Strands of something pale and bleached white. It clung to the vegetation and hung in the low branches like a macabre reb-reb. "There is more," Samuel said. He was standing about 6 feet away, pointing to the ground. "Look at the pressure marks, the way the earth is compressed." I examined the tracks more carefully. Each footprint was over 9 inches in length, and the depth of the prints told an important story. The creature that had made them was phenomenally heavy, far heavier than any bear or large predator that lived in this region. I made rough calculations in my mind. Based on the weight distribution and the depth of the prints, I estimated that the creature weighed somewhere between 1,200 and 1,500 pounds. And that was if it was on 2 legs. If it was on 4, "Benjamin," Samuel's voice was strained. "Do you hear that?" I stopped. I listened, and I heard nothing. The forest had gone completely silent. No birds, no insects, no wind. Even the sound of our breathing seemed muted and distant. And then I heard it, a sound like nothing I had ever heard before. It was a low, long, vibrating call that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It started low and rose in pitch, and it contained within it something that spoke directly to a primitive part of my brain, the part that remembers what it felt like to be prey, the part that understands, without being told, that death is close. I reached out and grabbed Samuel's arm. "We need to leave," I said. "Now. Do not run. Just walk calmly back toward the truck. Keep your eyes on the forest around us." We did not make it 10 feet before I saw it. It was standing on the ridge above us, at least 20 feet away, partially obscured by the twisted trunks of the burned trees. For a moment, I could not process what I was seeing. My mind was trying to categorize it as a known animal, a bear, a moose, something rational. But the shape was all wrong. It was massive. The estimates I had made based on the footprints had not prepared me for the sheer size of the creature. It stood roughly 8.5 feet tall. Its arms were disproportionately long, reaching down past its knees, and it was covered in fur, but not the brown or black fur of a normal animal. This fur was pale, milky white, almost translucent in the dappled light that filtered through the trees. But the thing that truly made my blood freeze was the face, or what I could see of it. The creature's eyes were large and dark, and they were fixed directly on me, not on Samuel, on me. And in those eyes, I saw intelligence, I saw awareness, and I saw something that might have been hunger or curiosity, or something far worse that I did not have a name for. For 3 seconds, we all stood perfectly still. Me, Samuel, and the pale thing on the ridge. 3 seconds that felt like an eternity. And then, slowly, the creature turned its head and looked directly at the forest behind it. And then it was gone. Not running, not attacking, just gone. It moved with a fluidity and silence that belied its massive size. Samuel made a sound that was halfway between a gasp and a sob. I realized that I was holding his arm so tightly that my fingers had gone white. I forced myself to let go. "Move," I said, and we moved. We did not walk calmly back to the truck. We ran. We crashed through the underbrush, ignoring the branches that whipped at our faces and tore at our clothes. We ran because something primal inside us understood that we had just come face to face with something that was far, far more dangerous than we could have imagined. It was not until we reached the truck and I had the engine running that I allowed myself to breathe normally. Samuel was crying, not making any sound, but tears were streaming down his face. His hands were shaking so badly that he could barely hold them still. "What was that?" he whispered. "What was that thing?" I did not have an answer to give him. Not an official one, anyway. But I had a memory of my father's voice, speaking in hushed tones to another ranger in the darkness of the station. A conversation about something pale and terrible that came to the mountains. A conversation that had ended abruptly when I had made my presence known. "I do not know," I lied. "But we need to figure it out, and we need to be very careful, because if we are right about what we saw, then we are in more danger than we realize." I was wrong about that. The danger was greater than either of us could have imagined. And before the sun set on that day, it would become clear that what we had seen was only the beginning, that the pale thing in the forest had been watching us, and that it had decided that we were interesting enough to follow. That night, I could not sleep. I sat in my office at the ranger station and I searched through the old logs, the records that went back decades, and I found them. Cryptic notes, mentions of something unusual in the woods, deaths that were never fully explained, animals found torn to shreds with no predator identified. And scattered throughout the records, in the handwriting of my father, were 5 words that made my heart skip. "It comes when the leaves fall." By the next morning, the entire scope of the situation had changed. Samuel had called in sick, which I understood completely. He was terrified, and frankly, so was I. But I had another problem. I had committed myself to understanding what was happening in Spruce Hollow, and I had limited time to do it. The key to understanding anything in the wilderness is observation. You watch the animals, you learn their patterns, you understand their behavior, and from that understanding you can predict what they will do next. But this creature was unlike anything in my experience. The tracks it left behind told me some things, but they left many questions unanswered. On Wednesday morning, I drove back to Spruce Hollow alone. I told the station that I was doing routine trail maintenance. It was not entirely a lie. I was going to maintain the trails by trying to stay alive long enough to gather more information. The previous day's fear had been replaced by something else, determination, and underneath that, a cold, methodical hunger to understand the creature that had fixed its dark eyes on me. The tracks from Tuesday had not changed. They were still there, pressed deep into the earth, but there were new tracks now. Tracks that led away from the initial encounter site. Tracks that went deeper into the hollow. Tracks that seemed to be heading toward the interior of the mountain. I began to follow them. The path took me through increasingly dense forest. The trees here were massive. Some of them looked to be over 300 years old. Their trunks were thick enough that 3 men could not have wrapped their arms around them. The canopy above was so thick that barely any sunlight penetrated. I had to turn on my flashlight, even though it was only mid-morning, and everywhere there was evidence of the creature's passage. Branches snapped at heights that no normal animal could reach. Claw marks gouged deep into the bark of the trees, and that pale fiber, that strange bleached material that seemed to be almost like some kind of degraded fur, clinging to everything. I was so focused on following the tracks that I almost did not notice the smell. But when it hit me, it was overwhelming. Rank, organic, like rotting meat mixed with something chemical, something wrong. I stopped in my tracks and brought my hand to my nose and mouth. That was when I heard the first sound. It was not the low, vibrating call that I had heard the day before. This was something different. It was a wet, tearing sound, the sound of something being ripped apart. I followed the sound forward, moving as quietly as I could through the dense undergrowth. What I found made me want to turn back immediately. There was a body. What was left of a body, anyway. A deer, a large buck with a full rack of antlers. It had been destroyed. The carcass was spread across an area of about 10 square feet. Strips of flesh hung from the branches, bones were scattered and crushed, and the blood. There was so much blood that it had actually pooled in a depression in the ground, creating a small lake of crimson that glistened in the beam of my flashlight. But what caught my attention more than the grisly remains was the method of the kill. Bears kill by crushing and biting the head or spine. Wolves and wild dogs attack the throat or the rear legs. But this kill was different. This kill was methodical. The buck had been attacked from above and from behind. Its back had been broken, its limbs had been torn from its body with deliberate force, and there were marks around the throat that suggested the creature had held the buck down and strangled it while tearing at its flesh. This was not an animal kill. This was not simple predation. This was something that suggested intention, purpose, a deliberate method of hunting and dispatch. I took photographs, 3 of them. And then I continued forward, following the tracks deeper into the hollow. The deeper I went, the worse the signs became. There were more carcasses, a raccoon, a porcupine, a smaller deer, each one destroyed with varying degrees of severity, each one killed in that same methodical way. It was as if the creature was practicing, testing its abilities, learning how to extract the maximum amount of suffering from its prey. I was beginning to understand something about the creature that had fixed its gaze on me. It was not simply hunting to feed, it was hunting to learn, to perfect. And that meant it was intelligent enough to study its prey, smart enough to understand cause and effect. The tracks eventually led me to a cave entrance. It was partially hidden by overgrown vegetation, but the signs of the creature's passage were clear. Deep claw marks, that pale fiber hanging from the rocks, and a smell so overpowering that I had to breathe through my mouth. I should not have gone into that cave. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to turn around, to leave, to never come back to this place. But I needed to understand. I needed to know what I was dealing with. The cave was deep and complex. I followed the trail of claw marks and pale fiber deeper and deeper into the darkness. My flashlight created dancing shadows on the stone walls, and the smell grew stronger, the smell of blood, and something else, something musky. Something that spoke of an animal den. After what felt like an eternity of moving through the darkness, the passage opened up into a larger chamber. I aimed my flashlight around the space, and what I saw made me stumble backward. The chamber was at least 40 feet across and nearly 30 feet high, and it was covered with the remains of meals. Bones were piled in heaps. Some of them were animal bones. I recognized deer antlers, the rib cage of a bear, the skull of what might have been a mountain lion. But mixed in with those animal remains were things that made my blood run cold. Human bones. Bleached white from age, but definitely human. I counted 17 separate skeletons scattered throughout the chamber. 17. All of them arranged in a pattern that suggested they had been collected deliberately, arranged almost like trophies. I wanted to examine them more closely, but the sound I heard stopped me. It was that low, vibrating call. But this time it was not distant. This time it was coming from deeper in the cave. From a passage that led further back into the mountain. I did not have any doubts about what would happen if I continued forward, and I did not have any doubt about whether I wanted to find out. I turned and I ran. I did not stop running until I burst out of the cave entrance and found myself back in the normal forest. I did not stop until I reached the truck, and I did not stop driving until I was back at the ranger station, my hands shaking so badly that I could barely grip the steering wheel. Samuel was there when I arrived. He looked like he had not slept. He took one look at my face and knew immediately that something catastrophic had happened. "What did you find?" he asked. I told him. Everything. The carcasses, the cave, the bones, all of it. As I spoke, I watched his expression shift from shock to horror to something that looked like resignation. "We have to report this," he said finally. "We have to tell the state. We have to tell someone." But I could not bring myself to do that. Because if I reported what I had found, there would be questions. Questions about how I had found those bones. Questions about whether those skeletons had belonged to missing persons. Questions that would lead to investigations. And investigations would lead to searches. And searches would lead to the deaths of other people. Because the thing in that cave was not some wild animal that could be tranquilized and relocated. It was something far, far more dangerous. Not yet, I said. We need more information first. We need to understand what we are dealing with. Samuel stared at me like I had lost my mind. And perhaps I had. But I had made a decision in that moment. I was going to learn everything I could about the pale creature in the mountains, and I was going to do whatever it took to make sure it never hurt another person, even if that meant keeping it secret. That night, I went back to the old station records, and I found something that I had missed before. A series of notations in my father's handwriting that referenced something called the Mountain Register, an old leather-bound book that supposedly contained all the oral histories and folk tales of the Pennsylvania Appalachian region. Stories that had been passed down from generation to generation. The notation said that the book was stored in the station basement, a place I had not been in years. I went down into the basement at 11:47 at night. The lights flickered on with a loud buzz, and I began to search through the dusty boxes and shelves until I found it. A leather-bound journal that was so old the pages had turned yellow. The cover was labeled The Mountain Register, compiled by Rangers Adams, Chen, and Miller, 1987 through 1993. I carried the book back up to my office and I opened it. What I read inside would change everything. There were entries about the Pale Watcher. That was what it was called in the old stories, the Pale Watcher of the Deep Mountains. According to the register, the creature had been sighted for centuries. Indigenous peoples had known about it. Early settlers had encountered it. Rangers dating back to the very beginning of the Ranger Service had recorded observations. The accounts were remarkably consistent. The creature was massive, pale white, covered in a fiber-like substance that was neither fur nor flesh. It was intelligent, it studied its prey, it hunted methodically, and it had an inexplicable attraction to humans. It would watch them, follow them, and occasionally it would take them. One entry, written by a ranger named Gregory Nelson in 1989, stood out above the others. 18 months of observation. The creature is not an animal, or rather, it is an animal, but one that possesses a level of consciousness that we do not fully understand. It has been observed counting. Yes, counting. It arranged stones in piles and then examined them, as if it were performing some kind of calculation. It has been observed using tools, rocks to break open animal bones to access the marrow, branches to fish in streams. This is not a simple predator. This is an intelligence in an animal form, and I fear that it has become aware that we are aware of it. I fear that it is now hunting us as we are hunting it. The register also contained accounts of the deaths. 23 people had disappeared in the region over the past 70 years, all of them in autumn, all of them either hikers or rangers, all of them taken from areas near to Spruce Hollow, and all of them presumed dead, though most of the bodies were never found. I sat in my office chair for hours, reading through those accounts, and as the night wore on, I began to understand the terrible truth. The Pale Watcher was not new. It had been here long before I was born. It would be here long after I was dead, and the only way to stop it would be to kill it. But how do you kill something that weighs 1,500 pounds? How do you kill something that is fast enough to catch a running human? How do you kill something that is intelligent enough to set traps of its own? By the time the sun came up on Thursday morning, I had not come up with an answer, but I had come up with a plan. On Friday evening, I called a meeting with Gregory Nelson, the same ranger whose entry I had found in the Mountain Register. He had transferred to a different station 15 years earlier, but he was still in the system. I had to go through 3 different people to find his contact information, but I eventually tracked him down to a small house on the edge of a town called Elmira, about 2 hours away from where I was stationed. When he answered my call, he sounded confused. I had not given my name. I had just said I was a ranger from the Pennsylvania system calling about a matter of importance. My name is Benjamin Green, I said. I am a ranger at the Spruce Hollow station, and I think you know what I am calling about. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. And then, you have seen it. I have seen it, I confirmed, and I have found the bones. Another silence. Longer this time. I will meet with you, Gregory said finally. But not on the phone, not over any medium that can be recorded. Come to my house tomorrow afternoon, 2 o'clock. Do not tell anyone where you are going. The next day, I drove out to Elmira. Gregory Nelson lived in a small house set back from the road, surrounded by thick woods. When I arrived, he was waiting for me on the porch. He was older than I had expected, perhaps 70. His hair was gray and his face was deeply lined, but his eyes were sharp, alert, and filled with something that looked like fear. "Come inside," he said immediately, and I followed him into the house. The interior was sparse and meticulously organized. Books lined every wall. Most of them appeared to be about cryptids, unexplained phenomena, mountain folklore, zoology, anatomy. On one wall was a map of the Pennsylvania Appalachian region, and on that map were dozens of red pins marking locations. Each pin, I would later learn, marked a sighting of the Pale Watcher. "How much do you know?" Gregory asked, pouring 2 cups of tea from a pot that was already sitting on the stove. "I know it hunts humans," I said. "I know it has been doing so for decades. I know it is intelligent, and I know that 17 of them are stored in a cave in Spruce Hollow." Gregory nodded slowly. "More than that have died. The ones in the cave are just the ones it has kept, the ones it has decided were interesting enough to preserve. Most of the bodies are never found, but the ones that are found, the ones that wash up in rivers or are discovered by hikers, they all have the same marks, the same method of killing." "Why has this never been made public?" I demanded. "Why is there no warning? Why do people still hike these mountains?" "Because," Gregory said carefully, "no one would believe it. How would you present this information? You would be laughed out of the Ranger Service. You would be assumed to be insane, and the proof you would need to gather would require people to go into the mountains. People would die gathering that proof. At least with the mystery, with the silence, the danger remains manageable. Most people die from accidents, falls, exposure, disease. The Pale Watcher claims far fewer victims than the mountains themselves claim." I sat down heavily in one of his chairs. "So you just accepted it? You just left it there?" "I tried to kill it," Gregory said quietly. "That is why I transferred away. That is why I left the system. I could not bear to be near Spruce Hollow after what happened." "What happened?" I asked. Gregory walked over to the window and looked out at the forest beyond. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "It was 1992. I was younger then, more confident, more stupid. I had convinced myself that I could trap it, use it as bait to lure it to a specific location where I could deal with it. I spent 3 months preparing. I gathered everything I thought I would need: high-powered rifles, explosives, traps. And then I went into the mountains." He turned to look at me directly. "It was watching me the entire time. I know that now. It had been watching me since the day I began the hunt, watching me prepare, watching me gather my weapons. And when I finally set my trap, when I finally thought I had it cornered, it was waiting for me." "What happened?" I asked again. "I went into a cave system. I thought I had driven it there. I thought it was cornered. I had explosives prepared. I was going to collapse the cave, bury it alive. And then I realized something was very wrong. The cave system was far larger than it should have been. And the deeper I went, the more I realized I was not hunting it. It was hunting me, hurting me, using the cave itself as a weapon." He pulled up his sleeve, and I saw something that made me flinch. His left arm was covered in scars, deep, long scars that ran from his wrist to his elbow. "It jumped me from above," he continued. "Came down from a ledge I did not even know was there. I still do not know how I escaped. I ran. I ran for hours through those caves, and I heard it behind me the entire time. That low call, that vibrating sound, but never close enough to grab me. Just hunting, always hunting. And when I finally burst out of the cave entrance, I collapsed on the rocks. I lay there for nearly 20 minutes before I found the strength to move. And when I did, I ran down that mountain and I never went back." "So it is unkillable," I said. "I do not know if it is unkillable," Gregory replied, "but it is far smarter than any animal should be. And it learns. Every encounter teaches it something. Every time someone tries to hunt it, it becomes more dangerous, more clever. That is why I left. That is why I never tried again. I realized that it could not be killed. It could only be avoided." I sat in silence for a long time, processing what he had told me. And then I asked the question that had been burning in my mind since I had found those bones. "Why does it keep them? The skeletons in the cave. Why does it keep them?" Gregory sat down across from me and regarded me with eyes that were filled with an ancient sadness. "Because it remembers them," he said. "Because on some level that we do not fully understand, it has a concept of death, of loss. And perhaps it keeps them because it is lonely. Perhaps it keeps them because it wants something from them that it can never have: intelligence, humanity, consciousness. It is, I believe, a creature that is profoundly, deeply alone. That night, I drove back to the ranger station in a state of confusion and despair. Gregory's words had crystallized something in my mind. The Pale Watcher was not a simple monster. It was something far more complex, something far more tragic. It was a creature that understood what it could never be. A creature that hunted humans not out of hunger but out of some desperate need for connection. But understanding did not change the danger. Understanding did not bring back the dead, and understanding did not make it any less necessary for me to do something. That weekend I made a decision. I was going to go back to Spruce Hollow. Not to hunt, not to kill, but to observe, to learn, to understand its patterns, its behavior, and maybe, just maybe, to find a way to coexist with it rather than destroy it. It was a dangerous decision, perhaps the most dangerous decision I had ever made, but it felt like the only choice I had left. On Sunday morning, I packed a large rucksack with supplies, a tent, a sleeping bag, food and water, binoculars, a recording device, and, in a moment of what might have been either wisdom or foolishness, I left my rifle behind. If I was going to approach the creature as an observer rather than a hunter, I could not go armed. That would only confirm its suspicions, only reinforce its belief that I was a threat. I told Samuel that I would be away for a week doing remote trail observations. I told the station that I was checking the backcountry trails for damage, and then I drove back to Spruce Hollow with nothing but my observations and my desperate hope that I might be able to survive a week in the mountains alone with something that had proven it was far more intelligent than any animal had right to be. I set up camp at a location that was about a mile from the cave entrance. Close enough to observe, far enough away to maintain a sense of safety, though I was not sure that safety was possible anymore. And as the sun set on that first night, I found myself thinking about all of the people who had come to these mountains before me. All of the hikers and rangers and explorers who had vanished without a trace. Had they come to understand what I was beginning to understand? Had they realized that the greatest danger in the wilderness was not the bear or the snake or the storm? The greatest danger was the thing that understood you as completely as you understood yourself. That night, for the first time since I had found the tracks in Spruce Hollow, I slept soundly. Not because I was safe, but because I had accepted that I might not be safe ever again. And once I had accepted that, fear seemed almost meaningless. The observation was about to begin. The first 3 days of my observation were uneventful. I saw no sign of the creature. I found no fresh tracks. I heard no calls in the darkness. But I could feel it. There was a presence in the forest that was impossible to ignore. A weight, a pressure, like something was watching me while remaining completely invisible. On the 4th day, I decided to push deeper into the mountains. I left my camp in the early morning and I followed the ridgeline that overlooked the central part of Spruce Hollow. From that vantage point, I could see for miles. I could track any movement in the forest below. I spent 12 hours sitting on that ridge with my binoculars and I recorded everything I saw. The movement of normal animals. The birds returning to the forest after my initial intrusion had sent them fleeing. The way the light changed as it moved across the mountainside. And then, just as the sun was beginning to set, I saw it. It was moving through the forest below, but not running or hunting. It was walking slowly, almost casually, from one location to another. And as I watched through my binoculars, I realized something crucial. It was not moving randomly. It had a specific destination. It knew where it was going. I followed at a distance, keeping to the high ground so I could maintain visual contact without being seen. The creature moved with surprising grace for something so massive. It did not crash through the underbrush. It did not break branches. It seemed to move with an almost liquid fluidity, stepping over obstacles that would have required a human to crawl or climb. Eventually, it led me to a location I had not yet discovered, a series of rocky outcroppings that formed a natural shelter. The creature entered the shelter and disappeared from view. I waited for nearly an hour, watching through my binoculars for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. As darkness fell, I made the decision to climb down from the ridge and approach the shelter. It was a calculated risk. If the creature came out while I was exposed on open ground, there would be nowhere to run. But I needed to see. I needed to understand what it was doing. I moved slowly down the ridge, using the darkness as cover. My eyes had adjusted to the night, and the half-moon provided enough light for me to see the basic shapes of the land around me. I moved carefully, testing each step before applying my full weight. And when I finally reached the rocky outcropping, I positioned myself behind a large boulder and waited. The wait lasted for 2 hours, and then I heard a sound that made my heart nearly stop. It was not the low, vibrating call that I had heard before. It was something different. It was a series of clicks and whistles, patterns of sound that seemed almost deliberate, almost like language. I peered around the boulder, and what I saw has haunted me ever since. The creature was sitting in the shelter, its massive form barely fitting in the space, and it was singing. Yes, singing, creating patterns of sound that were complex and repetitive. Its pale face was tilted upward, and its dark eyes were closed, and it was making sounds that should not be possible for an animal to make. But more than that, I realized what it was doing. It was singing about something. The sounds had structure, meaning. As I listened, I began to understand that the creature was communicating, not with anyone around it, but with itself, telling itself a story, or perhaps remembering something, some moment from its past, some experience that was significant enough to preserve in sound. I sat and listened to that terrible, beautiful sound for nearly 30 minutes. And when the creature finally stopped, it sat in perfect silence. And then it did something that shocked me even more than the singing. It picked up a rock, a smooth, rounded stone about the size of my fist, and it began to arrange other rocks around it, smaller rocks, pebbles. And as I watched through the darkness, I realized what it was making. It was creating a pattern, arranging the stones in a deliberate configuration. I had read about this in Gregory's account. The creature was counting, or perhaps it was making some kind of art, some kind of expression of its internal state. For over an hour it worked on this arrangement, painstakingly adjusting each stone, creating patterns and then destroying them and creating new patterns. And then, without warning, it swept the entire arrangement away. The rocks scattered and bounced on the stone floor of the shelter. The creature made a sound that I can only describe as a howl of frustration. It was the cry of something that had tried to express something vital and had failed. Something that desperately needed to communicate and had found the medium lacking. The creature stood up and turned, and for a moment I thought it was looking directly at me. But the shelter faced the other direction, and the darkness was deep where I was hiding. It could not have seen me, but somehow I knew it sensed my presence. The creature walked to the entrance of the shelter, and then it began to move into the forest. But before it disappeared completely from view, it made that low, vibrating call. A call that seemed to pass directly through my body, and I knew, without any doubt, that it was an invitation. It wanted me to follow. Every instinct I had screamed at me to stay where I was, to wait until it was gone and then return to my camp, to end this mad observation and leave Spruce Hollow forever. But I did not do that. Instead, I stood up. I left my hiding place, and I followed. The creature led me deeper into the mountains, away from the familiar territory of Spruce Hollow, away from anything I recognized. The forest became denser, more primal, like I was being led backward through time, through the centuries, back to a place that humans had never been meant to go. Eventually we arrived at another cave entrance. This one was much larger than the one I had found before. The opening was perhaps 20 feet across and just as high, and I knew with absolute certainty that this was the creature's primary dwelling place. The creature paused at the entrance and looked back at me. Its dark eyes reflected the moonlight. And then it entered the cave. I should have turned back. I should have run. But I did not. I took a breath, and I followed it into the darkness. The cave was immense. My flashlight seemed almost useless in the vast emptiness. The walls disappeared into shadow, the ceiling disappeared into shadow, and the floor beneath me was smooth from countless years of water flow. I moved slowly, carefully, trying not to fall. And as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I began to see things, shapes, patterns, arrangements. The creature had decorated its home, arranged stones into formations, created what appeared to be a shrine of some kind in the center of the main chamber. In that shrine were 3 objects, a leather journal, a watch, and a photograph. I approached cautiously and picked up the photograph. It was old and faded, but I could still make out the image. It showed a group of people in front of a ranger station, 5 of them, and one of them was unmistakably my father. My father had been here. My father had encountered this creature, and somehow the creature had taken something of his and preserved it, kept it. I realized in that moment that my father's death, 32 years ago, which had been attributed to a hiking accident, had not been an accident at all. A sound behind me made me spin around. The creature was standing at the entrance to an inner passage, watching me, waiting, and I understood that it had brought me here for a reason. It wanted me to see, to understand what it had preserved. Without thinking about the consequences, I picked up the journal and opened it. It was my father's handwriting, his observations, dated to 3 months before his death. And in those notes, he had documented everything. His encounters with the creature, his realization that it was intelligent, and his conclusion that it could not be killed, that it could only be understood. One entry in particular stood out. "I have come to a realization that terrifies me. This creature is not hunting us for sustenance, it is hunting for understanding. It wants to know what we are, how we think, what we feel. It collects our remains not out of malice, but out of a desperate desire to comprehend us, to somehow bridge the gap between its consciousness and ours. And I fear that this gap is unbridgeable. I fear that in trying to understand us, it only becomes more alone." The last entry was dated 3 days before my father died. It read, "I have made a decision. I will go to the creature. I will let it take me. Not because I want to die, but because perhaps on some level that transcends our understanding, it needs to know that we see it, that we recognize it, that despite everything, despite the fear and the danger, we are capable of understanding what it is trying to communicate. Perhaps that will be enough." I dropped the journal and I ran. I did not know if the creature was chasing me. I did not know if I was heading toward safety or deeper into the cave. I just ran. Panic had overcome reason. The understanding that my father had chosen to die, had chosen to offer himself to this creature, and that somehow, despite everything, his decision had been rooted in compassion. I burst out of the cave entrance and I found myself in an area I did not recognize. The moonlight was gone. Clouds had covered the sky, and I was completely lost in the darkness. I did not know how long I wandered. Hours, I think. My flashlight battery was dying. My legs were exhausted, and I was crying, though I did not realize it until the tears were already on my face. Eventually, I found myself back at my camp. I do not know how. I do not remember the path. But I fell into my tent and I collapsed into my sleeping bag, and I did not move again until the sun came up. When dawn arrived, I packed my rucksack. I packed it carefully and methodically, and I did not look back at the cave entrance. I did not look for the creature's tracks. I simply left, and I did not stop until I reached my truck and I was driving away from Spruce Hollow. Samuel was waiting for me at the station when I arrived. He was pacing the floor. His face was etched with worry. "Where have you been?" he demanded. "You said 1 week. You have been gone for 11 days. We were about to organize a search." "I am sorry," I said. "I lost track of time. The observation was complicated." "Did you see anything?" he asked. "Did you see the creature?" I wanted to tell him everything. I wanted to explain about my father, about the journal, about the creature's desperate attempt at communication. But I knew that I could not. No one would believe me, and more importantly, telling him would put him in danger. "No," I lied. "I saw signs of the creature, but I never encountered it directly. I think it is avoiding human contact. I think we should consider closing off the eastern ridge trails and making the area off-limits." Samuel seemed to accept this explanation. The next day, we filed a report recommending that access to Spruce Hollow be restricted due to animal activity. It was approved without question, and within 2 weeks the trails had been closed. Officially, they were closed for trail maintenance. Unofficially, they were closed forever. But the creature remained in those mountains. I have no doubt about that. It is still there, still hunting, still collecting those pale white fibers, still making its terrible, beautiful songs in the darkness of its cave. And my father's journal is still down there, in that shrine, preserved like a relic. Proof that my father understood something that I am still struggling to come to terms with. The years that followed my week in Spruce Hollow were among the most difficult of my life. Not because of the danger, though the danger remained real, but because of the knowledge, because of the terrible, unbearable knowledge that I carried every day. I knew what was out there. I knew what it wanted, and I knew that the only way to protect it was to lie, to deny, to maintain a silence that felt like it was eating me from the inside out. Samuel transferred to a different station after 6 months. I think he knew that something was not right about my account of the observation. I think he sensed that I was holding back crucial information. But he did not press me, and I was grateful for that. The ranger station continued its normal operations. We did our patrols. We maintained the trails that were still open. We assisted hikers and dealt with the occasional emergency. But it was all surface level, all performance. Because underneath I was consumed with the knowledge of what lived in those mountains. I began to research in earnest. I started traveling to other ranger stations. I interviewed retired rangers. I searched for records and documents that might shed light on the creature. And slowly, a picture began to emerge. The Pale Watcher had been in these mountains for centuries, perhaps longer. There were accounts from indigenous peoples that spoke of a pale thing in the deep forest, a creature that sometimes helped hunters and sometimes killed them, a creature that seemed to exist outside of normal nature. One account, translated from an Iroquois oral history, described it as a hollow thing, a thing that walks on two legs but has no spirit. It hunts not for hunger but for understanding. As I dug deeper, I found accounts from settlers, a few scattered mentions in journals and diaries, a notation in a 1887 geological survey that mentioned an unusual large primate in the Pennsylvania region, possibly a previously undocumented species, a whispered story in a bar told by an old man to an anthropologist about something pale that had taken his great-grandfather into the woods. All of these accounts described the same thing, but what struck me most was a pattern. The creature had never actually killed anyone who went to it willingly. All of the deaths I could find documentation for involved people who had tried to flee, who had tried to fight, who had rejected the creature's attempts at communication. My father, on the other hand, had gone willingly, and according to the journal that Gregory had mentioned when we spoke, my father had gone peacefully. That was when I began to understand what the creature was really hunting for. It was not hunting for bodies, it was hunting for acceptance, for some kind of acknowledgement that it existed, that it was real, and that it mattered. There was a passage in Gregory Nelson's account that kept coming back to me. He had written, "I have come to believe that the creature is not a predator in the traditional sense. Rather, it is a seeker. It seeks connection, and when it finds none, when it realizes that connection is impossible, it collects what it can, preserves what remains." On the 10th anniversary of my observation, I made a decision. I decided that I would go back to Spruce Hollow, not to study the creature, but to leave something for it. I took a leather journal, brand new, unmarked, and I spent a week writing in it, writing everything I knew, writing my observations, writing my father's final letter to me, a letter that had been found in his personal effects and that I had never shown to anyone else. In his letter, my father had written, "Benjamin, if you are reading this, then you know what happened to me, you know why I did not come home, and I want you to know that my decision was not made in despair but in hope. I believe that this creature is capable of understanding, capable of growth, and perhaps by offering myself to it, by allowing it to truly know one of us, I can help it in some way. I can help bridge that terrible gap between its consciousness and ours. Do not mourn me. Instead, understand that I am doing the only thing I know how to do. I am trying to reach across that gap, and that is enough." When I had finished writing, I made the long drive to Spruce Hollow. It took me 6 hours. The roads had been improved in the 10 years since my last visit. Technology had advanced, the world had changed, but the mountains remained exactly as they had always been, ancient, eternal, and home to things that humans were never meant to understand. I left my truck and I hiked into the forest. I did not go to the cave entrance. I went instead to a location high on a ridgeline that overlooked the entire hollow, and I left the journal there, placed carefully on a flat stone, weighted down with rocks so that it would not be blown away by the wind. And then I did something that I had never done before. I made that low, vibrating call, the call that I had heard the creature make countless times. I did not know if I was doing it correctly. I did not know if the creature would understand, but I made the call anyway, over and over, until my throat was raw. For a long time, nothing happened. And then, from somewhere deep in the mountains, I heard a response. That same low call, vibrating through the ancient forest, and I knew that it had heard me, that the creature understood. I left that day and I never returned to Spruce Hollow, but I received confirmation that my offering had been found. 2 months later, I received a package in the mail. No return address, no explanation, just a leather journal, my journal, and on the first page, in careful, deliberate markings, the creature had drawn something. It was simple, a circle. Inside the circle were several lines that might have been meant to represent people, or mountains, or anything else. But what struck me was the care with which it had been drawn, the precision, the intention. The creature was answering. I do not know how the journal made its way to me. I do not know if the creature somehow left it at the station, or if it found another way. And I do not know if what the creature drew was meant to be a message or simply an expression. But in that moment, I felt something that I had not felt in 10 years. I felt hope. Hope that somehow, in some way that transcended my understanding, I had managed to reach across that gap. I had managed to communicate with something that existed outside of human comprehension. And maybe, just maybe, that had been enough. I have kept that journal. It sits in my office at the ranger station. I never show it to anyone, I never explain its origin, but I look at that circle and those lines, and I know that somewhere in the depths of Spruce Hollow, something is drawing circles of its own, waiting, remembering, hoping that one day someone will come who understands. It is now 23 years since I first saw those tracks in Spruce Hollow. I have continued my work as a park ranger. I have maintained my silence, and I have come to terms with the impossible knowledge that I carry. The creature is still there. Of that, I have no doubt. Over the years, there have been reports. A hiker who turned back from a remote trail, babbling incoherently about something pale in the forest. A missing person in an adjacent county who was most likely taken. Reports of unusual animal attacks. But I have ensured that none of these reports are connected, that no one investigates, that the creature remains a mystery rather than a spectacle. And in that silence, I have found a kind of peace. My life is divided into two parts. There is the part that I show to the world, the competent ranger, the man who maintains the trails and helps lost hikers and writes reports about wildlife activity. That is the part that most people know. But underneath that is another part, a part that understands that the wilderness contains things we are not equipped to understand, that there are creatures in these mountains that exist outside of our categories, outside of our comprehension, and that perhaps, sometimes, the greatest act of love is to recognize those creatures and let them be. I have not gone back to Spruce Hollow since I left that journal on the ridgeline, but I often think about what is happening there, about whether the creature still wears that pale fiber over its massive frame, whether it still makes those terrible, beautiful songs in its cave, whether it still arranges stones and then sweeps them away in frustration. I wonder if it ever wonders about us, about the humans that it hunts and preserves and remembers. And I wonder if on some level that transcends our understanding it comprehends that we are capable of the same loneliness, the same desperate need for connection, the same yearning to be understood. My father was right in his final letter. The gap between consciousness and consciousness is a terrible thing, but it is not unbridgeable, or if it is, then at least in the bridging, in the attempt itself, there is something that matters. Something that transcends the fear and the danger and the terrible weight of silence. Samuel retired 2 years ago. He moved out of the state and I have not heard from him since. But sometimes I wonder if he understood more than I gave him credit for. If he too sensed the truth beneath my lies. Gregory Nelson passed away 3 years ago. I did not attend his funeral. I was not sure I was welcome, but I sent a letter to his house. In it, I thanked him for the knowledge he had shared, and I told him that I had finally come to understand that his attempt to kill the creature was not a failure. Rather, it was a necessary stage in my own journey toward understanding. That his failure was the foundation upon which my acceptance was built. I never received a reply, but about 6 months after his death I received another package, this one containing his personal journals, his observations, his own attempts to understand what he had encountered. And in those journals I found a passage that he had written just days before his death. I have come to believe that I was wrong about many things. I went into those mountains seeking to destroy something that was seeking only to understand. And in my attempt to kill it, I taught it fear. I taught it that humans were not worth understanding, and I have spent my entire life atoning for that mistake. If I could go back, if I could undo what I did, I would offer myself as the creature offered itself to us, not in defeat but in peace, in hope that perhaps the gap could be bridged. I am old now, and my time is running short. I wonder if the creature still remembers me. I wonder if it still bears the scars from my attempt to destroy it. And I wonder if, in the place where it dwells, it might be open to forgiveness. I added Gregory's journals to my collection. I have them stored safely, along with my father's letter, and I have added my own observations, a record, a testament, for someone who will come after me, someone who will understand, someone who will be brave enough or foolish enough to continue what my father started. The attempt to communicate across that impossible gap. The trails of Spruce Hollow remain closed. Officially, they are still under maintenance. No one seems to question this anymore. It has become accepted wisdom that that particular area is unsuitable for public access. And that is fine. That is how it should be. Because the hollow belongs to something else now. Something that was here long before we came, and will be here long after we are gone. But I am not afraid of it anymore. The creature in those mountains is not a monster. It is not a predator in any conventional sense. It is a consciousness, a desperate, lonely consciousness that is trying to reach across the void and make contact with something that might understand it. And maybe, in the end, that is what we all are. Consciousnesses crying out in the darkness, trying to bridge the gap, trying to make ourselves known, trying to find some small measure of understanding in an indifferent universe. I think about the creature often. I think about what it might be doing now. Whether it found the journal I left on the ridgeline, whether it understood the meaning behind the offering, whether it comprehends that someone saw it, really saw it, and did not judge it for what it was. And on the nights when I cannot sleep, I think about my father, about his final decision, about what he must have understood in those last moments when he came face to face with something that had chosen him not as prey but as something else, something more important than prey. I think about what he must have felt in that moment of contact, that moment when two consciousnesses, separated by a vast evolutionary gulf, finally touched. And I hope with all of my being that it brought him peace, that it brought them both peace. The pale watcher of Spruce Hollow still hunts, of that I am certain. But I no longer fear its hunts. I no longer see them as tragedy. I see them as communication attempts, as desperate grasping across the void. And perhaps, somewhere in those dark mountains, in some way that the living can never fully understand, the hunted and the hunter have found a strange kind of understanding. Perhaps that is enough. I am Benjamin Green. I was a park ranger for 23 years in the mountains of Pennsylvania. And this is what I know. This is what I have seen. And this is what I will carry with me until the day I die. There is something in those mountains. Something pale and terrible and beautiful. Something that hunts and remembers and yearns for connection in a way that makes my heart break every time I think about it. And I have made peace with that. I have made peace with the silence. I have made peace with the knowledge that the truth sometimes is stranger and more wonderful and more terrible than any lie we could tell ourselves. The hollow remembers. And I am the only one left to remember with it. And that, I have come to believe, is not a curse. It is a privilege. When they ask me how long I have worked in these mountains, I tell them 17 years. When they ask me if I have ever seen something that could not be explained, I go silent. That silence is the most honest answer I can give. My name is Raymond Rivera, and I was a ranger with the United States Forest Service covering the northern territories of the Appalachian Range. I am providing this account because someone needs to know what happens out there when the sun goes down and the tourists have all driven away. Someone needs to understand that not all sounds in the forest belong to things we have names for. My shift began at 6 in the morning on September 19th. The early autumn had turned the air crisp and the light had taken on that quality it always does this time of year, thin and somehow sad. I was driving up the ridge road toward the northern checkpoint when I saw him. That is what I said to myself immediately. Him, not it. The figure was humanoid enough to trigger that response. He was standing in a clearing about 200 yards from the tree line, completely still, facing away from my direction. I pulled the truck over slowly. My instinct was not fear but curiosity. The ranger station had received reports of trespassers in that area, and I assumed I had found them. I grabbed my radio and reported my position. Base confirmed they were sending another unit but said I should maintain visual contact. I grabbed my flashlight even though the sun was still up. An old habit from 16 years of forest patrol. The thing I noticed first as I approached on foot was that he did not move. Most trespassers run when they see a uniform. This one stood perfectly still. His posture was rigid, his arms hung at his sides. He wore clothes that seemed to be from no particular era, just a dark shirt and darker pants, both faded to the color of old smoke. As I got closer, maybe 50 yards away, I called out. I said this was federal land and that he was going to need to come with me to the station for identification. He did not respond. He did not turn around. I continued toward him, and that is when I heard it. It was coming from him, a sound. It was not a voice exactly, but it contained the architecture of one. Imagine if someone took human speech and pulled it like taffy, stretched it until each syllable took 3 seconds to complete. It was an attempt at words. I could almost understand it, but comprehension kept slipping away, like trying to remember something from a dream after waking. I stopped advancing. I stood there for what felt like a very long time, but was probably less than a minute. The sound continued to emanate from him, that terrible stretched speech, those almost words that kept their meaning just out of reach. My training told me to maintain protocol. My survival instinct told me something else. I keyed my radio and said the subject was unresponsive and displaying unusual behavior. Base told me to wait for the additional unit. When I looked up from my radio, he was gone. The clearing was empty. I had not seen him move. I had not heard him move. He had simply ceased to be in that space, and the forest had swallowed him completely. I searched the perimeter for 2 hours. I found nothing. No trail, no disturbed vegetation, no sign that anything human had ever stood there at all. The second unit arrived an hour later. Deputy Ranger Frank Baker was a man I had worked with for 3 seasons. He was practical and skeptical, which meant he was good company and terrible audience for what I had just experienced. I told him what I saw. He walked the clearing with me. He found nothing. He told me it was probably a drunk hiker and the isolation had made my mind play tricks on me. I accepted this explanation because it was easier than arguing, but I did not believe it. That night, back in my apartment off the ridge, I could not stop thinking about that sound, that stretched, almost speech. I played it over and over in my memory, trying to understand what the words might have been. It reminded me of something, though I could not place what. It was like seeing someone in a crowd who looks exactly like someone from your past, and you know the resemblance means something, but you cannot remember what. I slept poorly and woke at 4 in the morning with the absolute certainty that I had been dreaming about singing. The Forest Service gave me the next 4 days off. I spent them trying to rationalize what I had seen and heard. I told myself that my job had made me paranoid. I told myself that isolation bred these kinds of experiences. I told myself many things, and none of them stuck. On the 5th day, I returned to work. Base assigned me the southern route, away from where I had encountered the figure. I appreciated this without mentioning it. The southern route covers about 40 miles of maintained trail and services, 3 observation posts. It is usually the quieter assignment, the one given to rangers who need to think or who are dealing with personal issues. I was both. I spent the day moving from post to post, checking equipment, filing reports, and trying to do anything except return to the northern sector. But at around 3 in the afternoon, I was at the observation post overlooking Black Rock Valley when I saw something that pulled me back toward concern. There was a group of hikers about a quarter mile into the valley, moving in a pattern that made no sense. They were walking in a line, following each other, but they were not following a trail. They were moving perpendicular to all the established hiking routes, moving deeper into territory that became progressively more dense and dangerous. I radioed Base and reported the unauthorized hikers. Base said they would send a unit to intercept. I got down from the observation post and began moving toward the group. Standard protocol said I should have waited, but something about their movement pattern triggered the same instinct that had stopped me from approaching that figure on the ridge. By the time I reached the valley floor, I could count 6 of them. They were moving slowly, and they were moving in absolute silence. No chatter, no footfalls that I could hear, nothing. Just the sound of branches moving where their bodies displaced them. I began to close the distance, calling out to tell them they were going off trail and needed to return to the marked routes. None of them stopped. None of them turned around. They continued their march deeper into the forest as though I had not made a sound. I was maybe 30 yards away when the wind shifted and a smell came across the valley. It was not the smell of unwashed hikers. It was something else. Something like soil and copper, and something else I could not identify. Something that made my skin contract on my arms. That is when I heard it again. Not from the figures in front of me, but from somewhere deeper in the forest. That sound, that terrible stretched speech, that almost music. Multiple voices now, or perhaps the same voice echoing from different directions. They were calling to each other, those elongated phrases that almost formed words, almost conveyed meaning. The figures in front of me stopped. They stood completely still. And then, as one, they turned around and looked directly at me. Their faces were pale and empty of expression. Their eyes had the quality of mirrors that reflect nothing. I have been afraid before in my life. I have hiked through bear country. I have been in vehicle collisions, but I have never experienced the pure, profound wrongness that came when those 6 faces turned toward mine. I did not wait for backup. I ran. I ran back toward the observation post, and I did not stop until I reached my truck. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the door open. I drove away from Black Rock Valley and did not look in the rearview mirror. When I reported to base what I had seen, I did not mention the figures or the sound. I said I had assessed the hikers visually and determined they were skilled and did not require intervention. Base accepted this. Deputy Ranger Frank Baker, who was monitoring my communications, seemed to find this plausible. He did not mention the discrepancy between my observation post location and the route I drove back. That night, I began to research. I started with local folklore. with the stories that rangers passed down to each other in the station during the long night shifts. There were stories about the Appalachian Mountains that predated the national forest, stories told by settlers and then by their descendants. One story came up repeatedly, mentioned in passing by older rangers, treated more as a joke than a warning. The woodland crooner. That was the name. That was what they called it. The story, as it was told to me through half-remembered conversations I had to piece together, went something like this. In the deep Appalachian forests, there existed something that sang. It did not sing in any way that matched human music, but it sang nonetheless. It sang in the voices of people, stretched and distorted, made into something that almost resembled language but maintained just enough strangeness to put all animals on edge. The old settlers said that if you heard it singing clearly, it meant the crooner had noticed you. If you heard it multiple times, it meant it was following you. And if you ever heard it approaching your home, you were already marked. No one knew what it wanted. No one knew what it did with the people it marked. The only documented patterns were absence and silence. Hikers would vanish from these mountains every few years. Some were found, some were not. The Forest Service attributed most disappearances to accidents or voluntary abandonment. But the old families, the ones who had lived here for generations, they knew better. They said it was the crooner. They said it was always the crooner. I sat at my desk with my laptop open, searching through decades of missing persons reports from the National Forest region. 17 disappearances in the past 30 years. That number seemed both large and terrifyingly reasonable for a territory this vast. But what struck me was the pattern. They were not random, they clustered. Multiple disappearances in single years, followed by years of nothing, as though the crooner had periods of hunger and periods of satiation. I was checking the reports for 2019 when I found something that stopped my breathing. A woman named Catherine Hall had disappeared while hiking solo in the northern sector on September 21, 2019. She was never found. The disappearance was attributed to a hiking accident. There were no witnesses. Her last known position was marked on the report. The date matched my timeline. September 19th, when I saw the figure. 2 days before the woman disappeared. The location was less than 3 miles from where I had encountered him. I did not go into work the next day. I called in sick, which was true in a sense. My body was functioning, but my mind was coming apart at the edges. I spent the day on my floor, my laptop in front of me, going through every missing persons report in the Forest Service database that I could access. I compiled a list. I cross-referenced dates. I looked for patterns in location. What emerged was a map, not literal, but conceptual, a geography of vanishing points. Certain clearings showed up repeatedly, certain ridges, certain water crossings. It was as though the crooner had preferred hunting grounds, places where the probability of an encounter was elevated. Some of these locations were easy to reach from parking areas. Others were deep in the wilderness, accessible only to experienced hikers or rangers who knew the territory. By the time evening came, I had constructed a timeline spanning 18 years, 19 disappearances, 32 documented sightings of unusual activity in the forest, strange markings found near disappearance sites, footprints that did not match any known animal, sounds heard by multiple rangers that they dismissed as wildlife or wind or the thousand ways that a forest can deceive the ear. I was not the first to encounter the crooner. I was not special. I was simply the first to admit to myself what I had seen. The knowledge of this was worse than the fear. I returned to work on the third day because I did not know what else to do. Base gave me the northern route again, as though my time away had reset some rotation. I took it without comment. I needed to return to that territory. I needed to understand what had happened and what was happening. The clearing where I had seen the figure was undisturbed. I spent several hours there, cataloging the area, looking for anything I had missed the first time. There was nothing new to find, but I noticed something I had not before. The forest around the clearing was quiet. Not quiet in the way that forests are quiet, full of small sounds and movements. Quiet in the way that a held breath is quiet. The trees seemed to be waiting for something. I was about to leave when I heard it. Not the woodland crooner's song, but a voice, a human voice. It was calling from deeper in the forest, from the direction of the tree line. It was a woman's voice, thin and distant. She was calling for help. She said her name was Catherine. She said she was lost. She said she was very cold. I did not move. I stood in the clearing and I did not move because I had read her disappearance report. Catherine Hall had been missing for more than 5 years. If that was her voice, then what was I listening to? And if it was not her voice, what thing was I listening to that could duplicate a voice so precisely? The voice continued to call. It continued to beg. It sounded so authentic, so desperate, so undeniably human in its distress. Every part of my training told me to respond to a person in need. Every part of my instinct told me that responding would be the last decision I ever made. I walked back toward my truck. The voice followed me. It called my name. How it knew my name, I cannot explain. I did not look back. I drove away, and I did not stop until I reached the ranger station. Frank Baker was there when I arrived. He took one look at me and asked if I was well. I told him I had encountered unusual activity on the northern route and needed to file a report. We went to his office. I told him about the voice, but I did not tell him about Catherine Hall or the missing persons pattern or any of the conclusions I had drawn. I told him I heard what might have been a person in distress and that I had attempted to locate them but found no sign of their presence. Frank listened to my report with the expression of a man listening to something he did not quite believe. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair. He said something that changed everything. He said he had been meaning to talk to me. He said that when I was coming back from Black Rock Valley, he had listened to my communications more carefully than he had let on. He said he had noticed that my description of the hikers did not match standard deviation from what would be normal reporting. He said specifically that my voice had changed when I was describing them. I did not know what to say. Frank continued. He said he had been a ranger for 23 years. He said he had encountered things in these mountains that did not have good explanations. He said most rangers learn to see and not see, to experience and not report, to know things without acknowledging that they know them. But he said there was another option. He said some rangers eventually decided that the pretense was too exhausting. He opened a drawer in his desk and removed a folder. It was not a Forest Service folder. It was old and unmarked. He placed it on the desk in front of me. Inside were documents in handwriting. They were personal accounts. They were written by rangers whose names I recognized. Some of them people I had worked with. Some of them people who had retired years ago. Each account described encounters with something in the forest. Each account described the same phenomenon, something that could mimic voices, something that could imitate human forms, something that moved through the territory according to patterns that suggested intelligence and purpose. Each account concluded with a similar advisory: do not respond to voices in the forest, do not approach figures that are isolated and still, do not assume that what appears human is human. One account was written by a man named Alexander Hall. It was dated 18 years ago. In it, he described going into the forest to search for his daughter, who had disappeared. He described hearing her voice calling to him from deep in the woods. He described how hard it was not to go to her. He described how he knew, absolutely, that if he followed that voice he would not come back out. At the bottom of the account, in shaky handwriting, he had written, "If anyone reads this, please tell Catherine the first I'm sorry. I heard her and I did not come. God forgive me." I sat in Frank's office for a very long time without speaking. When I finally looked up at him, I saw that his eyes were full of a sadness that seemed very old and very deep. Frank told me more that afternoon than any ranger in that station had heard in years. He told me about the thing in the forest. He called it the crooner, as the old settlers had done, but he also called it other things. He called it the imitator. He called it the lure. He said different rangers had developed different theories about what it was, where it came from, whether it was one creature or many. What was certain was this: it was real. It had been in these mountains for as long as anyone could document, which meant at least 200 years, but was probably far longer. It hunted. It needed to eat something, though no one could say with certainty what. Its method of hunting was to become what you wanted or needed to find. It was a perfect imitator. It could take the voice of a person you loved. It could take the appearance of a figure in the clearing. It could even, Frank theorized, take the shape of another ranger if the situation required it. But there was a limit to what it could do. This was essential knowledge for survival. It could imitate the outside of things, but it could not imitate consciousness. It could create an almost person, but that almost person would not pass sustained scrutiny. It could produce speech that approximated language, but that speech would be subtly wrong. It could move like a human, but there would be moments of discontinuity, as though the mechanics of human movement were something it had to actively calculate. Most importantly, it could not create the thing that most clearly marked a human being, which was context. A real person had layers of continuity, memories, established relationships, causal chains that connected them to the world. An imitation could not generate these things. An imitation could only suggest their presence. If you listened carefully, if you thought clearly, if you did not allow emotion to override observation, you could detect the falseness. Frank told me about the woman, Catherine Hall. He said she had been hiking solo, which was already a risk. He said she had gone off trail, which was where the crooner seemed most active. He said her father had later tried to find her, and the crooner had taken him too, or at least that was what was suspected. The Forest Service had eventually discontinued the search. I asked Frank why the Forest Service did not shut down the park, why they did not prevent people from hiking in such a dangerous territory. Frank smiled bitterly. He said because officially there was no danger that could be documented. The disappearances looked like accidents or voluntary withdrawals. The sightings could not be verified. The sounds could not be recorded. If a ranger tried to file an official report describing a creature that hunted humans through imitation, that ranger would be removed from duty and possibly referred for evaluation. So instead, the Forest Service allowed a very specific knowledge to exist in the margins. Experienced rangers were taught, through whispers and examples and shared stories, how to survive in the territory. They were taught to be skeptical of their perceptions. They were taught to assume that nothing in the forest was exactly what it appeared to be. They were taught to trust documentation over sensation, reason over emotion. And every few years, when someone did not remember these lessons or refused to believe them, the disappearances would happen again. I asked Frank what I should do. He said that was my decision to make. He said I could continue working as a ranger in this territory, knowing what I now knew, following the protocols that the experienced rangers had developed, or I could transfer to another national forest, or I could leave the service entirely. There was no shame in any of these choices. The forest was not a place for everyone. I chose to stay. I do not know if this was courage or cowardice or simply the inability to walk away from the work I had committed to, but I stayed. The next phase of my employment was different. I stopped reporting unusual sightings through official channels. Instead, I maintained my own documentation, notes that I kept in a personal journal separate from any Forest Service file. I began to map the territory more carefully, marking the locations where encounters were most likely, understanding the terrain well enough that I could navigate it in my sleep if necessary. I learned to hear the crooner's song differently. Instead of being afraid of it, I became attentive to it. The song changed depending on what the crooner was hunting. When it was trying to lure someone specific, the song took on characteristics of that person's voice, their speech patterns, their particular way of forming words. When it was hunting generally, the song became more abstract, stretched further from anything that could be called language. On 3 occasions, I encountered other people who had disappeared from the historical record. One was a man named Peter Edwards. He had vanished in 1997, and he was still in the forest 27 years later, moving through the trees, wearing the same clothes he had worn the day he disappeared, unable to leave, calling to people with his voice that was slightly stretched and wrong. The second was a woman I did not recognize, who moved through the forest with that same peculiar gait, responding to nothing, seemingly searching for something she could not find. The third was someone I almost became. It happened on my 10th month in the territory after receiving Frank's knowledge. I was on the northern route, responding to an emergency call about a lost child. The call had come through the station, and base had instructed me to investigate. I drove to the reported location and began hiking into the forest. I was maybe 2 miles into the search when the sounds began. A child's voice, crying, calling for help. A voice that was approximately the age of my younger sister, who was 8 years old and lived 2,000 miles away. The voice was calling for someone to find her, saying she was lost, saying she was scared. I remembered Frank's lesson. I stopped moving. I began to think clearly. A child did not call into a ranger station and then disappear into the forest 2 miles from civilization. A child's voice, perfectly preserved at that age, in a location this deep at this time, made no logical sense, and when I heard the voice again, I noticed something I had not before. It did not have the variation that a real child has. Real children, even when frightened, have inconsistency in their speech. They jump between feelings. They have distraction and hope and panic and stubbornness, all within moments. This voice had only one emotion. It had only one goal. It was singing a single note that happened to take the shape of a child begging for rescue. I radioed base and reported a false alarm. There was no emergency. I was returning to the truck. I did not investigate further, and I did not respond to the voice. I drove back carefully, and I did not look into the forest. When I returned to the station, Frank was waiting for me. He did not ask what happened. He simply nodded, which meant he already knew. Some rangers, he had told me, learned to sense when the crooner was hunting. It was like feeling pressure in the air before a storm. After a while, you could almost feel when it was active, when it was moving through its territory with purpose. I have been working in these mountains for 17 years now. It has been 7 years since I first encountered the crooner, and I have learned to live with it. I have learned to work in its territory while maintaining the boundaries that keep me on the side of the living. I have learned that the forest contains things that require respect and distance and an absence of assumptions. But I have also learned something else. In all my encounters with the imitation people, with the stretched voices and the false calls for help, I have never encountered genuine malice. The crooner does not seem to take pleasure in hunting. It is simply what it is. It is part of the forest's ecosystem in the same way that predators are part of any ecosystem. It hunts because it must. It hunts in the way that it hunts because that is the way it was made to hunt. I think sometimes about Catherine Hall's father, Alexander, still in the forest after all these years. I wonder if he heard his daughter's voice calling through the trees for the rest of his life, or if he eventually learned to stop responding to it. I wonder if peace is even possible for someone the crooner has marked. And I wonder about the thing itself. I wonder if it is lonely out there, in those dark and endless mountains, singing songs that are almost human but never quite reach the threshold of language. I wonder if it understands what it is doing, or if it simply acts according to instinct, a predator doing what predators do, neither good nor evil, simply present. I do not know the answers to these questions. What I know is this: the forest is still there. The crooner is still there, and on nights when the wind comes through a certain way, I can still hear the sound of it singing, stretched and distant, calling for someone who will not answer. I am still here, and I am still listening.